originally, then Long Break, and I'm now Ann Martin. And I grew up in Bristol. I was the youngest of 4 children. My father was John and Marguerite Landis. My mother grew up in Bristol. Her 2 sisters also grew up in Bristol, and my grandma lived here, as did her great-grandfather and grandmother, as did her great-great-grandfather and grandmother. So I've got a long history in Bristol, family-wise. My mom grew up, she was born in 1913, so a lot of her later years later teenage years were tainted by the Depression that was taking place. And my grandpa Martin, well, they just moved a lot when she was growing up. They'd rent a house, stay there until the rent ran out, and then they moved to another house in Bristol and stayed there until the rent ran out, and so on. But she loved Bristol. And so then when she and my dad were married, they moved to Elkhart and lived there for a while, and several other places. Then he went into the Army during World War II, and when he was in the Army during World War II, he was then sent overseas, and he wanted to make sure that my mom, and she had 3 children by then, wanted a stable place, or two and one on the way when he left, for them to live. And so they bought the house where Linda Powell now lives, on the corner of Bristol and Apollo Street in Bristol, Indiana, and that's where I grew up and lived all my life until I left home. I want to tell one interesting story about Findlay. That was my grandma Martin's father, my great-grandfather. Findlay owned the grocery store, it was actually a general store, which was, when I was growing up, was King's Grocery Store. And he also helped build the old Condon drugstore, which is across the street from there, that's now been torn down. But he owned that general store until the Depression of the late 1890s, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, but that's what you learn when you study family history, and that's when he had to give up the proprietorship of that store. Now we're in I was born in 1946, and Bristol did not have kindergarten for me. My 2 older sisters went to kindergarten, but they abandoned it by the time I came along. So I started 1st grade at Bristol. At that time, everybody K to 12 was in, 1 to 12 was in the same building. And so I spent my first 5 years in that building, and they built the new elementary school. And I went 6th grade there, and then back to the Bristol High School from grade 7 to 12. Had a lot of fun. Had just the cool thing for me growing up in Bristol is everybody could do everything. We were small enough classes, and you could be in a choir. Well, they didn't have girls' sports in those days, but we did have a girls' athletic association. But you could be in choir and band and take all sorts of classes, and we just had fun. I was a town person. I've got good friends that sort of lived out in the country and were sort of jealous of all the town people. So growing up in Bristol was just a lot of fun. One of the things that was really nice, everybody felt very safe here. We all had stories to tell, the things we did that were a little bit on the mischievous side, including me. But so you didn't go too far along, because you knew your parents were going to find out about most everything you did, because that's just the way Bristol was. Everybody looked out for everybody else. But we'd play softball. Well, we used to play behind the old fire station, which is now moved. But we played ball behind the old fire station, and we'd play till dark. And then when that got changed, we'd go play down behind the school. I was always supposed to be home before dark. Of course, the ball field was out there, no trees or anything around, and then all of a sudden I'd look up at the street and I'd realize, oh dear, the street lights are on, because I had to be home before the street lights came on. So I was almost always, but they forgave me, and they liked who I was with, and so that was fun. and we used to mess around in the old opera house. It had not been turned into Elkhart Civic Theater yet at that point. And of course, we weren't supposed to be in there, but it was so fun, and all the playbills are up there, and it was just so much fun. And then one day, Bill Stutzman was the town marshal at that time. One day he saw that we were in there, and so we saw him coming towards us, so we scurried out the back door and went over and sat on my front porch, which is just catty-cornered across the street from there. And so Bill, we didn't fool Bill. He knew exactly what we were doing. We were just sort of twiddling our thumbs like we'd been there all afternoon. And he didn't make us fess up or anything. He just said, you were trespassing, and that's against the law, and please don't do that again. And we said we wouldn't, but of course we did. But we were more careful from then on. But it was just a wonderful, wonderful way to grow up. And so many of the kids lived in town then that it was just easy to get a group together at any time, and we just had a really good time. A lot of us were all in the same activities. We had a Girl Scout troop at that time we'd been together since second grade. The girls' choir, a lot of us went to Bristol United Methodist Church. Well, it was Bristol Methodist Church then, and then it became Bristol United Methodist, and now it's Bristol Community Church. But we all were part of the youth group there, and had wonderful time going up to retreats on Quarry Lake, and the Legion would have hay rides in the fall, and we just had a wonderful way to grow up. We were a small group. I only had 38 in my graduating class, but we became very close. One of the unique things I think about growing up in Bristol was that you could not see somebody for 10 years, sometimes even 20 years. You say, hey, aren't you blah, 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 and yes, yeah, and you just start talking as if you'd seen each other yesterday. And that's just one of the wonderful things. And then it gets into do you remember when? And oh, yeah, and then story after story. And it's just cool.